evening, everyone. Welcome to the St. James Lecture Series. We're very excited to be able to share this program with you. It's been a long-standing St. James tradition to bring engaging speakers to our community and our neighbors here in Wilmington. Before we begin, we'd like to offer a brief moment of prayer. So if you please. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night. Give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous, and all for your love's sake. Amen. Through these unique and challenging times, we thought who better to share their thoughts on the Christian response to the COVID-19 pandemic than local professor, physician, and hospital epidemiologist for New Hanover Regional Medical Center, Dr. Paul Kamitsuka. Welcome, Dr. Kamitsuka. Thank you so much for taking this time to be with us this evening. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to St. James Church, and particularly to my friend Frank Gibson, for this opportunity to share with you this evening about the role of faith in my vocation as a practicing physician and as hospital epidemiologist during the COVID-19 pandemic. For me, faith and vocation are inextricably intertwined, although I readily confess that in this effort, I regularly fall short. To understand how faith came to play such a role for me personally, I wish to first share with you a little of my background and what shaped my theological perspective. In the second half of this talk, I will then share my thoughts from this perspective on the Christian response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I was graced with parents who dedicated their lives to living in faith through their work as Presbyterian missionaries to Japan, and to providing a powerful foundation for me and my siblings. My parents grew up in California as second-generation Japanese Americans. Both were from humble backgrounds marked by tragedy and struggle. My father's father, became a fruit and vegetable wholesale transporter after emigrating while a teenager with his brother from southern Japan to the United States. He was initially taken in by the Quaker community in Whittier, California, and later converted to Christianity. My father's mother was a Buddhist, but nonetheless made sure that her children attended their local church in Pismo Beach. At the age of 16, my father inexplicably announced to his shocked parents that he intended to become a minister after attending a revival in a neighboring town. They were devastated, as they intended for him to actually take over the family business. But he never wavered, and he was an enthusiastic member of his local church. Later, however, he suffered perhaps the most hurtful experience of his early life when that very church rejected him because of his racial heritage in the days following the attack on Pearl Harbor. My mother never knew her father, as he died of appendicitis in 1922, shortly after her birth. In the years that followed, her family moved from rural California to the city of Oakland. And while my father's upbringing was rough and tumble, my mother had a much more cultured upbringing. She studied the violin, while her stepfather would toil as a landscaper for her teachers in exchange for lessons. World War II changed the lives of both of my parents, as it did for so many. Both their families lost most of their earthly possessions when they were forced into relocation camps under Executive Order 9066. My father was taken to the Arizona desert and my mother to Utah. My father's sister, disabled due to an accidental brain injury as a young child, was forcibly separated from the family. The family was not informed where she was being taken, and my father's mother, stricken with worry and heartbreak, soon died in camp where medical care was sparse. Despite this, my parents never harbored bitterness for the injustice that befell them in the hysteria of the early war years. Now, remarkably, while my parents were both in camp, they were separately chosen through special invitation to leave their respective camps and to attend college. My father was invited to attend Park College in Missouri, an act that was met with intense and bitter local protest, but courageously defended by Dr. William Lindsay Young, the college president, and also, as it turned out, supported by Eleanor Roosevelt after the so-called Battle of Parkville gained national attention. My mother was invited to attend Westminster Choir College in Princeton, New Jersey, where she trained as a singer and choral director. At Westminster, under the tutelage of her mentor, John Finley Williamson, she regularly traveled with the school choir to New York to sing in Carnegie Hall with the likes of the New York Philharmonic. On weekends, she would informally play chamber music with Princeton resident Albert Einstein, who also, like her, played the violin. Following college, my mother felt the calling to become a missionary to Japan, which was struggling in the wake of the war, and she prepared to go. Prior to leaving, however, she went to Chicago to visit her parents, who had settled there after the war. My father attended McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, and as destiny would have it, one Sunday my father was preaching at a church where my mother was the guest soloist. She must have really sung her heart out because after a few short months and perhaps some divine intervention, they were married and joined the mission field together as a married couple. Now, post-war Japan was still a place of utter devastation when my parents arrived in 1949. After further training in Tokyo, they were assigned to the northern island of Hokkaido, which was the least developed major island of Japan, sort of the Siberia of Japan. My father asked the governor where the poorest area was on the island, and he was directed to the coastal town of Satana on the Japan Sea. There he established a three-love center: love for God, love for man, and love for soil, a Christian community center for the training and supply of local dairy farmers and the community at large. And he split his time between Satana and the College of Dairy Agriculture outside of the capital city of Sapporo, where he taught theology and served as chaplain. My mother devoted her life to teaching music and directing choral groups and bringing music to the churches that they would visit. In 1963, Dr. Williamson from Princeton conducted the first televised performance of Handel's Messiah in Hokkaido. My mother performed as soprano soloist, as her students, along with my father, sang in the choir. A fragment of this performance is preserved on the internet on YouTube, thanks to my nephew. The church in post-war Japan was a struggling church. Less than 1% of the population was Christian. Being Christian there was somewhat akin to the early church. Christians experienced ostracism, rejection by their families, and for those converting from Buddhism, a profound sense of guilt for abandoning their ancestors. Discipleship was costly, not cheap. Church congregations were small, with devout members who sacrificed much to be there. Where 2 or 3 are gathered literally described the humble churches of the time. It was in this setting that I, along with my siblings, were born and raised. My parents actualized their faith in their work, and they led by example. They taught us that the place of Christianity was in the world, not a spiritual retreat from it. They taught us that faith is confessional, not dogmatic. Our aim is always to discern the will of God in life situations we face, and to be in tune with that will in our actions and responses. Knowing that our fallibility means that we might inevitably get it wrong. But we are to get it back up, acknowledge and confess our failing, and to seek to tune back in. The life of faith, we were taught, is a dialectical interaction with the world, where one continually seeks to take corrective action as our failings are realized. There's no place for hubris, for pride, or for dogma. There is every place for gratitude and humility. We were also taught to be unafraid to take a stand, and that sometimes taking a stand was our duty. We were to stand for healing, for justice, for reconciliation. Early on, we were exposed to the works and life of the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who ultimately suffered martyrdom at the hands of the Nazis for his involvement in the plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. We were also taught to always look out for those less fortunate than us. Beggars would often come to our home where they were welcomed. We were assigned to keep them company and perhaps to polish their shoes while my parents would hastily make sandwiches or other food for them. We were also taught to have an attitude of detachment from financial wealth. Wealth could be a tool if properly used, but was never an end unto itself. Finally, we were taught that any field of endeavor could be brought to bear in the life of discipleship. As it turned out, one of my brothers became a concert pianist and teacher. My sister became a social worker and therapist. My other brother became a theologian, college professor, and dean, and I became a doctor. My decision to enter medicine was made at the age of 14. I can't tell you how or why I made that decision. I consider now in retrospect that it was an act of grace, for at that age, I had no earthly idea what the field would actually entail. I still had no idea when I entered college, traveling 7,000 miles from what was then home in Tokyo to a small Quaker liberal arts college in Indiana called Earlham. At Earlham, I majored in theology and in biology. I had wonderful, dedicated teachers who would invite us into their homes for seminars and discussion. Under their tutelage, I was deeply influenced by the works of H. Richard Niebuhr, his brother Reinhold, Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Soren Kierkegaard, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. With this and my college background in the sciences, I went off to medical school, still not knowing what the life of medicine actually entailed, yet determined to pursue it. As I progressed in my training, I realized just how fascinated, how satisfied, and how spiritually rewarded I was in medicine. It became evident that the choice to pursue medicine really was never mine. Rather, I was chosen. I thankfully found that I deeply enjoyed using the tools of science to bring healing to others, and equally enjoyed the teaching of medicine. I never have viewed medicine as a job or as work. Of course, like anyone, I sometimes tire of the hard labor and long hours that accompany it. But when all is said and done, I rejoice in being given the opportunity to use my knowledge and skills in my life as a Christian. In the gospel, Jesus heals the sick. He feeds the poor. He speaks out against untruth, pride, and injustice. He reaches out to the least among us. He summons us to follow him, to be his disciple. And he teaches us the meaning and cost of discipleship. He teaches us that as Christians, our primary task is to ask, what is God's will, and to act in accordance with it. And he assures us that God is at work in history in real time. So from this perspective, what now of this pandemic? What are the lessons to be learned from it, and how our nation has dealt with it? What should we as Christians, as a church, be focused on? The pandemic is happening in real time, and we are challenged to respond to it as Christians. The Christian response must, above all, be to protect the weak and the vulnerable from this virus and its consequences, with a purity of intent, born of faith and love. Unfortunately, what we have witnessed in the past year is how politics, misinformation, utter selfishness, and hubris has poisoned this intent at the national, state, and local level. This is perhaps most clearly exemplified by the corruption of the simple act of masking by politics and by misguided conceptions of American freedom. Early in the pandemic, we learned that wearing a mask primarily protects others from us if we happen to be infected with the virus. With that knowledge, all Christians should have leapt to the opportunity to mask. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. The Christian imperative is crystal clear. Masking is not a political statement. It is an expression of faith, of love, and of discipleship. The notion that our personal freedom is somehow restricted when we are asked to mask is clearly subservient to a much higher command to care for others. None of us is knowingly free to spread disease and suffering to others, no more than we are free to run red lights or to cry fire in a crowded theater. People die as a result of such actions. The ultimate loss of freedom is suffered by those who contract COVID from others, who are hospitalized, unable to breathe or speak, and who ultimately succumb to this disease, as so many already have. The church as a whole must not be silent on this issue. It should be leading the effort to bring all of our brothers and sisters to this understanding. The recent suit brought to the Supreme Court by churches and synagogues in New York against the governor's restrictions on the number allowed to gather indoors is particularly regrettable. Science tells us that indoor gatherings are the chief means by which the virus spreads. For the church not to support such measures in order to protect lives, including the lives of their own congregants, and indeed to file suit against it, seems to me unimaginable from the faith perspective. The court majority wrote, "The restrictions at issue here, by effectively barring many from attending religious services, strike at the very heart of the First Amendment's guarantee of religious liberty. Even in a pandemic, the Constitution cannot be put away or forgotten." To this, I would respond, what about God's law of protecting the vulnerable and love for others? Moreover, is there anything in the restrictions that actually constrains religious liberty? I think not. Religious liberty does not mean enjoining followers to gather in ways that needlessly endangers lives. The church should rather be protecting their congregations by resourcefully reaching out to them for worship in ways that are known to be safe. That freedom is in no way being restricted. To equate Christianity with large indoor gatherings is a fundamental misunderstanding. Are we not told that for where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them? Matthew 18:20. The second lesson of this pandemic, already implied, is the imperative of using the tools that we've been given, namely science, to inform how we respond to this threat. The attacks on science, on dedicated scientists and public health officials, the ridicule of mask wearing, and the undermining of trust in agencies such as the FDA and CDC have, in a word, been misguided and dangerous. We must speak out against them. As healthcare providers, we utilize the tools given to us to effect healing. Just as a carpenter depends on his saw, science is our essential tool. As Christians, we are summoned to use scientific knowledge to treat the sick, to prevent suffering, and ultimately to do God's work. Attacks on science based on political ideologies or conspiracy theories have been with us for years. But in recent years, these have alarmingly escalated, stoked by social media and propaganda outlets not dedicated to the truth, but rather to their own agendas, in this case leading to suffering and death. Science is not political. Science seeks the truth, only reaching conclusions that are verifiable beyond reasonable doubt by using experimental methods. As in any human endeavor, there are occasional bad actors who alter data to support fallacious claims. But such individuals are invariably rooted out, their publications rescinded, and their reputations forever tarnished. There is little tolerance for unsupported assertions in science. Intense scrutiny is brought to bear on scientific publications through a network of peer review. Every author must then defend their assertions in response to criticisms from others in open letters to the editor, which appear in the journal issues that follow. Statistical methods are applied to minimize the role of chance, and studies are repeated by other groups. Assertions are tested in different populations to assess their generalizability. In short, science is about the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The scientific method is inherently humble. It starts with a question and rigorously seeks an answer, whatever that answer may turn out to be. Science is fully cognizant of and continually seeks to correct for human error. Scientific methods are designed to be earnest, cautious, and as free from corruption as possible. The same cannot be said of those who attack, ignore, or ridicule science, and those who dogmatically make assertions without credible evidence. The widespread emergence of embracers of untruth threaten us all as we seek to prevent suffering, heal the sick, and protect the world we live in. Far too many people still consider COVID-19 to be a hoax. We must ask ourselves how and why human beings are so susceptible to untruth, so easily led astray, even in the face of so much evidence to the contrary. Under very different circumstances, Dietrich Bonhoeffer raised similar questions when faced with the masses of German Christians who supported Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. How could they have been so misled? Could they not see what was happening? Particularly notable was the alarming speed with which Hitler enacted the unthinkable. He persecuted and executed members of the Jewish community, those with disabilities, and anyone who did not conform to Nazi dogma. As time passed, the more blasphemous and emboldened Hitler became. The church remained silent, and this silence exacted a tremendous cost. Christians soon found themselves forced to swear allegiance to Adolf Hitler, not to God. They allowed horrific and blatant untruths to go unchallenged, increasingly fearful of violence against any with the courage to speak out. The misguided conspiracies of the Nazis and their pseudoscience of racial purity and eugenics prevailed, culminating in the ruthless slaughter of millions. Now, the speed with which such horrific events occurred in the 1930s reminds us of how important it is for us as Christians to pay close attention and to speak out against untruths early before they gain wider acceptance. Whenever our leaders propagate an untruth, and when a large segment of the population seems so willing to accept an untruth, such as the COVID-19 being a hoax, we not only have a public health problem, but a moral crisis as well. Untruths are often cleverly coupled with other grievances, such as racial bias. And with social media, they may instantly go viral and take on a life of their own. When untruths threaten health, livelihoods, and justice, Christians must speak out. Now, the current pandemic, coming as it does in the 21st century, should have been a stark contrast to the bubonic plague of the 14th century, when science as we know it did not exist. But regrettably, it has not, primarily because of actions this nation chose not to take, namely following the science. History will record how we in the United States willfully squandered scientific knowledge for political purposes, enabling the virus to wreak havoc. The simple reality is that most of the suffering caused by this pandemic could have been prevented if we simply used the public health tools already in hand. Other countries that did, such as Taiwan, New Zealand, and even China, effectively eliminated this virus from the shores without the benefit of a vaccine. To this day, the total number of COVID deaths in Taiwan, with a densely crowded population twice that of North Carolina, remains at 7. And this was accomplished without shutdowns or business closures. So what should we have done? But when we first got wind of the virus threatening us in January, we should have restricted travel from areas of the world already hit and implemented aggressive screening and testing at all ports of entry, especially our airports. We should have aggressively employed isolation, contact tracing, while the numbers were still relatively small. Much greater emphasis should have been placed on creating and disseminating rapid diagnostic tests. And once the value of masking became apparent, by February or March, there should have been a national mandate to mask. Our leaders should have brought the nation together behind this effort, as we historically have during dire challenges of the past, such as the 2 world wars. Instead, and sadly, we failed to heed the warnings and follow the successful example of others. In a country that has utilized mandatory conscription in wars against our enemies, a mandate to mask is but a small, short-term constraint as we battle against this deadly virus. Far from restricting our freedom, masks are the principal means by which we protect and restore the freedoms we've lost as a result of this pandemic, such as getting together with family and friends, travel, our children and grandchildren attending school, and dining in restaurants. Now, there's also been an unfortunate attempt to place or displace blame for this pandemic and its toll on others, namely China. But viruses don't know or respect geographic borders. Indeed, data suggests that the 1918 influenza pandemic, which killed over 50 million people worldwide, may well have begun in the United States. The 2009 H1N1 pandemic started in Mexico. MERS-CoV started on the Arabian Peninsula. The Ebola epidemic started in West Africa. And mutation analysis reveals that the COVID-19 virus in the United States mostly came to us from Europe. The point is that pandemic viruses can arise anywhere in the world. It's simply a matter of random mutations during replication that enable the virus to cross species, from birds to pigs to humans, in the case of influenza, for example, from bats to civets to humans in the case of SARS-CoV-1, from bats to camels to humans in the case of MERS-CoV, and from bats to pangolins to humans in the case of this virus, SARS-CoV-2. And subsequent mutations enable the virus to spread efficiently from human to human. The current virus is a supreme example of one that acquired these abilities. Viruses seek hosts, any hosts, whatever the race, creed, or color. And with modern air travel, all of us around the world are vulnerable. COVID-19 is actually the third coronavirus epidemic or pandemic in just the past 18 years, following SARS-CoV-1 in 2003 and the Middle East coronavirus MERS-CoV in 2012. Avian influenza or bird flu poses a constant pandemic threat, and it's only a matter of when, not if, it will occur. So all of us must learn the lessons of this pandemic and apply these lessons in the future, lest we repeat the tragedy of the past year. Taiwan learned from their experience in SARS-CoV-1, and their incredibly rapid and effective preemptive response to SARS-CoV-2 is evidence of this. With this pandemic now already widespread throughout our country, our task is much more difficult. We must strenuously dedicate ourselves to the task of overcoming it. But we can do this. All of us should seek to be leaders in this effort as an act of faith and love for others. While the task is daunting, there is a path forward, a light at the end of the tunnel. The first and most urgent task is to convince everyone that they must wear a mask, distance, perform hand hygiene when leaving the home. Everyone must wear masks when visited by someone outside of one's immediate household. Such visits must be minimized both in time and frequency. Meeting outside is safer than indoors. And we mustn't forget that even close friends, family members, or relatives, and those with no symptoms can still unknowingly spread this infection. Indeed, up to 40% of those who are contagious with COVID-19 feel entirely well. Masks, as it turns out, are astonishingly effective, but only if everyone wears them. This was illustrated earlier this year in a report of 2 hairdressers in Missouri who continued to work despite being symptomatic with COVID-19. They, of course, should not have done this. However, both of them wore masks, as did almost all of their 139 customers, and despite close contact, none of the customers became infected. It's estimated that if everyone masks, the number of new cases of COVID-19 would drop dramatically within 4 weeks. Countless lives would be saved. So as weary as we are with masking and distancing, they are the only effective tools we have, and we must continue to practice them over the next year as we await the distribution and uptake of a safe and effective vaccine. Second, if transparent data indicate that upcoming vaccines are both safe and effective, as it currently appears, we must be vaccinated when our turn comes and encourage others to do so. It's thought that we will not reach a state of vaccine-induced herd immunity where new cases of COVID don't spread because enough people are immune until at least 70% of the population is vaccinated. Getting over 220 million people, 70% of the population, vaccinated will be a monumental logistical task in the months ahead, particularly with vaccines that require cold storage and 2 doses. But recent polls indicate that over 40% of Americans will not take the vaccine, even if shown to be safe and effective. This will have to change. Now, caution with regard to safety is certainly warranted. Too little time has passed since vaccine trials began to know with absolute certainty that there will not be any unforeseen adverse events. But assessments of risks and benefits characterize all medical interventions, including acts that we mindlessly engage in, such as taking an aspirin for a headache, for example. Nothing is totally risk-free. In medicine, we recommend interventions only when the benefit far exceeds the risk. As a physician, I will be personally reviewing the safety data as it becomes available. And I will also be seeking the opinions of experts in vaccinology whom I trust not to be influenced by politics or conflicts of interest. And if science indicates benefit far exceeding risk, then I will be an enthusiastic proponent of this vaccine as part of the cause of defeating this terrible virus. The final point I would like to make from a faith perspective is that this pandemic provides us with an opportunity as Christians to provide assistance and comfort to those devastated by it. The pandemic has taken a grievous toll on many, not only lives lost, but also by threatening or even destroying livelihoods. Many businesses are threatened or forced to close. There are long lines at food banks. The number of homeless is increasing. Those suffering from neglected medical problems or from depression or anxiety have been hard hit, and many of us feel isolated. So this Christmas season, we must commit ourselves to contributing of our time and resources to meaningfully provide for and comfort those in need as a result of this pandemic. For those of us fortunate enough to have been spared, this is our duty. We do so gladly and with gratitude. Let us brighten the dark months ahead with the warm, healing light of compassion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kamitsuka. At this time, we'd like to open up the floor for questions. If you would please use either the Q&A or the chat window, we'd like to hear from you. Now, Dr. Kamitsuka, I know before panelists joined, you and I were discussing kind of the timeline for even getting that quantity of vaccines available.
Right. Yeah.
Could you speak a little more on that?
Well, it's going to be a gradual process. I'm told that North Carolina, we have 85,000 doses that have been allocated to North Carolina, initially targeting frontline healthcare workers, and also as a second tier, those who are in nursing facilities, those who are most vulnerable from this virus. But it's going to be a real challenge to deliver this vaccine. The vaccine that we'll be getting here in North Carolina is the Pfizer vaccine. And as most of you know, this requires storage in a very cold freezer, minus 80 degrees. And many facilities don't have such equipment. Here at New Hanover Hospital, we do. They're cleaning it out now to make sure it's ready. And the way the vaccine will be shipped is in vials with 5 doses each. Once you thaw it and dilute it, you only have about 6 hours to give the vaccine. So it's going to be an issue of lining people up to be able to give this efficiently. The other issue with this virus is this vaccine is it takes 2 doses, 21 days apart. And so you have to round everybody back up to get the same vaccine, Pfizer to Pfizer or Moderna to Moderna, the second time. So, and as more vaccine becomes available, then we'd be able to move it out to more people to really try to get to the goal of vaccinating most of the population. I think for most people, it's really not going to be available till probably spring, and then progressively thereafter, which really underscores the point about why masking and distancing, things that we've grown so tired of hearing, but really are our only tools to mitigate this virus. It is so important.
Right, we have a question from Betty. She says, thank you for a cogent and encouraging talk. Can you suggest ways of convincing anti-maskers to mask?
So this is a difficult question because the anti-maskers trying to reason with them or to provide evidence becomes difficult. It becomes an issue of their own personal freedom. I guess one way is to really try to reach out to them from a faith standpoint of view. What does the Bible tell us to do in this circumstance? And I think it's quite clear that our first responsibility is to protect others, to protect the vulnerable. And any fair reading of the Bible, that of the New Testament in particular, that is one of the most powerful messages. And so that's why I was appealing from a faith perspective for us to try to share that perspective. It's also why I was so disappointed with the case that was brought to the Supreme Court, because houses of worship, whether they're churches or synagogues, should really be on the front line to broadcast the message that masking and distancing really are part of what our faith would lead us to do. So it's a difficult message. I think we probably need some divine intervention to sort of be able to communicate, but to the extent that we are able, I think we do need to try. And if more and more people, if more and more churches come out and in a public way and endorse this as something that they believe is an act of faith, I think that that may help turn the tide in terms of other people coming around to understanding that that is the case.
All right, we have another question. This is Dr. Kamitsuka. Thank you so much for addressing our audience. We appreciate your faith-based insight. The question is regarding inside versus outside gathering, specifically worship services that last 30 to 40 minutes. Based on what you have seen in the recent spike, do you feel it's safe for more than 10 to gather in person outside, even as the governor allows it for religious groups?
Yeah. If it's outside and if family groups cluster with distance between family groups and people are masking, then it should be safe. It's certainly safer outside than inside. The problem with inside is that the way this virus spreads is primarily by droplet spread. So I'm talking, and you may have a spray of very small respiratory droplets. If it hits your eye or it hits your mouth or your nose, then I could transmit a virus from me to you. The problem with indoors is those little droplets over time can further dehydrate. And so then they become airborne particles. And all it then takes is for you to breathe, because it's in the air. It remains suspended in the air. So the more people you have gathered, especially if they're not masked, the more likely it is that you create an environment where airborne particles can be in the air, so that all it takes is to breathe the air. Now, there are other variables like how many air exchanges per hour, if there's ventilation, windows are open, so forth. But you get the idea in terms of how the risk rises. So, I think that if you have distancing indoors with masking, that's certainly safer using hand sanitizer, but then trying to keep things as brief as possible. Again, because the longer people are together in a group, the more likely the droplet spread becomes.
And a similar question would be, thank you, doctor. What is your recommendation for visiting family members? What would your recommendations be if we are still socially distanced and wearing masks?
Yeah, so same principles. I mean, basically, if you are visiting anybody, or if someone else is visiting outside of your household to your house, then really the only safe way to do it is everybody masks. But for example, it's hard to mask and eat dinner at the same time. And so if everybody masks and keeps distance, and if weather permits, you can eat outside and separate the family groups so that each household sort of sits apart, then it could be relatively safe. One of the tragedies of this virus is really for us to mitigate spread at this time. Unfortunately, during the holidays, it really is going to mean that we really do need to stay put. We should not be traveling. We should not be having people coming into our house from other households for any but brief periods of time. We are in the middle of a real Thanksgiving surge that's just in the beginning of happening because of these kinds of behaviors. Before Thanksgiving, I was saying that I really don't want Thanksgiving to be the Grinch that steals Christmas, because people who become ill at Thanksgiving, they're really not going to become clinically sick or hospitalized until toward Christmas. So this is a Christmas where we need to be creative. We need to do things like these Zoom meetings. Over Thanksgiving, what we did with extended family, we all sat down together at the same time with Zoom. So we had all these groups in New York and Ohio and Maryland and here, and we had a 3-hour dinner, but everybody was totally safe because there was no contact. That's probably the safest way to do it. And again, it's a tragedy. This is what happens when you let a virus become widespread, and so that community spread is high. And I will say in Wilmington, a couple weeks ago, the percent of tests at New Hanover that were positive was about 5 or 6%. Today, it's over 16%. And we're anticipating that as a result of Thanksgiving, it may go even further. So unfortunately, I wish I could say otherwise, but this is one holiday season where we really have to hunker down. And as Christians and as a church, we have to that much more reach out to people who may be isolated so that they can get through this until we get to a point where most people are vaccinated.
Now we do have kind of a follow-up on that. If a family member has had COVID and has since tested negative, how safe is that to be around them?
Okay, so a couple things to clarify. One is what a COVID test means. A COVID test just means that you are negative that day. So just because you were negative 3 days ago doesn't mean that you won't be able to transmit the disease now if you, in the meantime, were exposed to somebody that gave COVID to you. So people sort of misunderstand what a test means. Test only means you're negative that day. The other thing is, what about someone who's had COVID? Are they then immune so that they can't give you the virus? And the answer to that is maybe not. And we do think that in most cases, once you have a case of COVID, that there is a period of time when you are resistant to having a second episode. But we do know now that you can have a second case of COVID. And the case that really brought this to our attention happened in Hong Kong. There's a person, a 38-year-old person who caught COVID, was sick, got better, and then 4.5 months later was returning to Hong Kong, and they screened him at the airport, and he was asymptomatic, but he tested positive again. Now, they were able to determine that he was infected with a different COVID virus than the first time, because they were able to do molecular fingerprinting and realized that the second virus had mutations that the first virus did not have. So there were 2 separate infections with COVID. Now, the second time, he was not symptomatic, he was not sick, but he was potentially contagious. And him not being sick, is it because he gained some immunity from his first infection, or is it because he was in the 40% of people who are asymptomatic infected? We don't know the answer to. But second infections do occur. So just because someone visits your house who had COVID before, we have to still consider them potentially a risk, so that everybody has to.
Okay, we do have another question that's kind of along that topic, and then we'll try and shift focus because we do have a few questions about the vaccine. This question says, thank you for taking the time to speak to all of us. Based on the evidence, what is the reason that some people have long-term repercussions and others don't?
Good question, and the most honest answer is we don't know. And I would sort of look at other viral infections. Let's take mono, for example. Why is it that some people have no symptoms with mono, other people feel sick for a couple of weeks, and other people have this sort of prolonged recovery? I think a lot of it has to do with how individual immune system respond to the viral infection. And the immune responses run a big spectrum. And part of the immune response has to do with stimulating the emergence of these chemicals called cytokines, some of which make us feel bad. For example, if I were to inject someone with interleukin-1, they would spike a fever. If I gave them tumor necrosis factor alpha, they would stop eating. This is like you might wonder in terms of patients with cancer, some patients sort of wither away. It's because of these cytokines. So there is a powerful and very complicated interplay between our immune response and the production of these cytokine chemicals, which is how the body communicates to other cells within the body. And all that will have to be raveled out over time. I suspect we will never quite know the answer to that, just as we are still unable to precisely tell with infectious mono why some people seem to have such a hard time afterwards and for such a long period of time.
Okay, we're going to switch gears and go to a couple questions on the vaccine side.
Sure.
This one says, should we not be shocked that the vaccine will probably cause us to get somewhat sick as it activates our immune response? I'm afraid when people hear of this response, they won't go get the vaccine. I hope this will be transparently explained to people to educate them. Do you think the possibility of getting sick in response to vaccine is a possibility?
So it depends what you mean by sick. So could you have soreness at the site, maybe a low-grade fever for a day or two, or just sort of feel like you got the flu for a day or so? Sure, that it has been reported, and that's likely to occur. Just like some people have those reactions with other vaccines. You got the shingles shot, you may feel poor for a couple of days. Even the flu shot, sometimes people don't feel well afterwards. But that's not getting the infection. Now that is just your body reacting to getting the vaccine. It's your immunologic response. But those types of reactions tend to be short-lived. Certainly a small price to pay compared to being vulnerable to actually getting the disease. And we're always looking out for other more serious side effects. For example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which has yet to be approved, they halted that trial for a while because there was one patient who got that, who developed a temporary paralysis disorder called transverse myelitis. But they worked through the data, and there was really no statistically significant increase relative to transverse myelitis in the general population. So they determined that it was most likely coincidental, not causal, from the vaccine. And that's what enabled them to resume the trial. But we're always on the lookout for unforeseen side effects, but we should all expect that certain things like low-grade fever, soreness at the site of the vaccine may well occur, just as they do with other vaccines. And again, it's a risk-benefit assessment, and we only recommend things where the benefit far outweighs the risk, as it appears that that will be the case with this. But yes, the data should be transparent and will be transparent. I would be looking to people, as I said earlier, who I trust not to be corrupted by conflicting interests or politics. People like Anthony Fauci, for example. He's been in the field for decades, and at every point he's been very consistent in terms of only sticking to the science and looking at efficacy and safety. So if people like him are on the airways really promoting the vaccine, I think they carry a lot of credibility and weight, and I would listen to them.
Any thoughts on the decision by UNC, Duke, and Novant not to require their employees be immunized?
Yeah, so we discussed this at New Hanover, and I think that being a new vaccine, since we cannot guarantee safety based on the data, the decision was made to not require it. We would encourage it, and particularly as I see more data coming out that in fact validates safety, as is my full expectation. Certainly the British equivalent of the FDA determined that was the case. Then I would be in a position of encouraging people to get it, just like I encourage everybody to get the flu shot. But at this early stage, the decision was made not to mandate. I think as more experience comes out, as we see more people around the world getting this vaccine and people lining up to get it and becoming more comfortable with it, because as we would expect, they are not coming down with adverse effects. And as the pandemic keeps rolling out, as we would expect over the next weeks, I suspect people will be in increasing numbers willing to take the vaccine, and should take the vaccine.
When the vaccine is available, do you recommend that children get the vaccine when parents receive it?
So none of the vaccines have yet been approved for children or for pregnant women. So those studies are pending. When those studies are done and data is reported, and if it looks to be safe and effective, then yes. But the study started with looking at adults. So that's why adults are the target population initially.
And we're going to shift gears again. This one's more on the scientific side. How much mutation is occurring or has occurred within the virus?
Interesting, an important question. It has. The coronaviruses, like this virus is, do, like all RNA viruses, they do mutate. Not quite at the fast rate of a virus like influenza. But influenza also is an RNA virus. And RNA viruses in general, mutation is the strategy for their survival in nature. And when they reproduce their genome, they inevitably make mistakes. And unlike DNA viruses that have a correcting enzyme, many of these RNA viruses don't. And some of those mutations randomly select for important properties from our standpoint of view, like the ability to transmit effectively from person to person. So I sort of liken RNA virus replication to having a bad secretary with attention deficit disorder typing at warp speed with no corrector time. And that characterizes the mutation frequency of viruses like influenza. Now, in that context, COVID, the coronaviruses are less likely to mutate, but yet we have seen significant mutation. And the question is, will some of those mutations also give rise to changes in those critical parts of the virus, such as the spike protein, which is the target for the first two vaccines coming out, so that it could impact the efficacy of the vaccine. So far, no evidence of that, but it's obviously something that we're looking out for carefully.
This one goes back to focusing on the kids. What evidence is there that elementary school age children transmit the virus? How much risk is there of elementary schools staying open around the country?
So the data, fortunately, has come out that that the risk is not as high as one might expect, and therefore the decisions of many communities, including, for example, New York City, to open up the K through 5. I think even so, we have to protect the teachers. In particular, so protocols for masking, for distancing, plexiglass, hand hygiene, all need to be in place. But I think it's an allowable risk, and in this way, it differs a little bit from influenza, where kids are probably the germ factories that really spread the virus. But kids can get sick with this virus. We've seen a number of them. And on the whole, the younger you are, you tend to tolerate the virus better than as we age. So, you know, that another one of the tragedies of this virus is the whole impact on kids in education. And to the extent that we get data that enables us to safely get kids back in school, starting with K through 5, I think that's something that we need to do. But that's also why it's so important to emphasize the masking. We said earlier that if everybody masked, we would dramatically reduce the community prevalence of this virus. By dramatically, I'm talking about, you know, up to say 80% within 4 weeks. If we do that, it'd be much easier to then open schools, because you're going to have less spread. It'd be much easier to do contact tracing and isolation because the numbers are much smaller. But when you get to the kinds of numbers that we have now, it's just not possible to do that effectively.
So, Dr. Kamitsuka, we are at 8 o'clock. If you would indulge me, I do have one final question that I'd like to ask.
Sure.
What can we do to help support the healthcare workers as this continues?
Well, I think the most important thing, again, if we can talk to our friends, talk to our relatives, really spread the message in terms of, I feel like a broken record, of masking, distancing, not getting together. As much as we'd love to be able to get together, but this holiday season, these next, say 2-3 months, we really have to be very careful in terms of not spreading this virus. At New Hanover right now, we're really on a precipice. If we have a big surge, we already have such a high baseline of cases. If we have a big surge, it's going to really compromise our ability to provide protection. So get the message out, and also practice the distancing and the masking. And that would be the best way to help and support us in the healthcare community, because that really is all we ask for. is for people to really try to bring down the number of cases so we can do our job in terms of taking care of not only those who are sick with COVID, but with everything, every other disease that we also get.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. We really have enjoyed having you.
Sure. My pleasure. My pleasure. And thank you for the invitation.
All right. Well, everyone have a wonderful evening, and we will have this presentation available for replay upon request. Have a great night and stay tuned to St. James social media for more opportunities. Have a good evening,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye. Good night.